The driver. Jack Sullivan was driving down Route 66, the radio blasting classic rock, when he saw her. A young woman drenched from the rain, standing by the roadside with her thumb out. Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled over. "Need a ride?" Jack called out, rolling down the window. She nodded, her wet hair plastered to her face. "Thanks. My name's Laura." Jack didn't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her seemed different. She climbed into the passenger seat, shivering. As they drove, Jack noticed her glancing nervously at the road behind them. "Running from something?" he asked. Laura hesitated. "Just trying to get away from a bad situation." Jack didn't press further. They drove in silence for a while, the rain pounding on the roof. Jack had a dark secret. He wasn't just any driver on Route 66. He was the driver, known to the few survivors as the man who picked up hitchhikers and took them on a one-way trip to hell. He looked over at Laura, her eyes closed as she dozed off, and smiled to himself. They reached an old diner just off the highway. Jack pulled over. "You must be hungry. Let's grab a bite." Laura opened her eyes, looking wary but hungry. She nodded and followed him inside. The diner was almost empty, the waitress barely looking up as they sat down. Jack ordered 2 coffees and a couple of burgers. As they ate, he watched Laura. She seemed fragile, on the edge of something he couldn't quite place. After they finished, they got back in the car. Laura was visibly more relaxed now. Jack decided to take a detour, heading towards a secluded area he knew well, the place where he usually did his work. Laura didn't notice at first, but as the road got narrower and darker, she grew tense. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Just a shortcut," Jack replied, his tone too smooth. She looked out the window, the forest closing in on them. Panic set in. "This isn't the way to the next town." Jack pulled the car to a stop. "We're here," he said, a sinister smile spreading across his face. Laura's door flew open, and she bolted into the woods. Jack cursed and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, chasing after her. Laura ran through the dark forest, branches scratching at her arms. She could hear Jack's footsteps behind her getting closer. She stumbled into a clearing and fell to her knees, exhausted. Jack appeared, looming over her. "No more running, Laura?" But then something strange happened. Laura looked up and her eyes glowed in the dark. Jack stepped back, confused. "You picked the wrong girl," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before Jack could react, Laura transformed. Her body twisted and elongated, becoming something inhuman, a creature of the night. Jack screamed, but it was too late. The hunter had become the hunted. The next morning, Jack's car was found abandoned by the roadside. The police searched the area but found no trace of him. Laura, or whatever she had become, was never seen again, and so the legend of the hitchhiker on Route 66 grew, a warning to those who would pick up strangers on dark, lonely roads. You never know who or what you might be inviting into your car. The long road. Jake Palmer had been hitchhiking for years, ever since he was a teenager looking to escape the confines of his small, suffocating hometown. He'd travelled across the country more times than he could count, relying on the kindness of strangers to get from one place to the next. He thought he had seen it all, every type of driver, every type of car, but nothing could have prepared him for the night he met Walter Gray. It was a humid evening in late August, and Jake found himself stranded on a desolate stretch of Route 54, somewhere in the Midwest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty road. Jake adjusted his backpack, stuck out his thumb, and hoped for the best. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a pair of headlights approaching. The car, an old battered Chevy Nova, slowed to a stop beside him. The driver leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. "Need a lift?" the man asked, his voice gravelly and deep. Jake peered inside. The man behind the wheel was in his late 50s, with thinning grey hair and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that caught the fading light. He had a friendly, if somewhat weary, smile. "Yeah, thanks," Jake said, climbing in. He tossed his backpack into the back seat and settled into the worn leather seat. "Name's Walter," the driver said, extending a hand. "Walter Gray." "Jake Palmer," Jake replied, shaking his hand. Walter put the car in gear and they started down the road. "Where you headed, Jake?" "Just trying to get to the next town," Jake said. "Figure I can find a place to crash for the night." Walter nodded. "Fair enough. Not much out here but cornfields and old memories. I can get you to Fairview. Shouldn't be more than an hour or so." Jake relaxed a little, grateful for the ride. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets outside. The road stretched out before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the endless fields. "So, Jake," Walter said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you travel a lot?" "Yeah, you could say that," Jake replied. "Been hitchhiking since I was 16. Seen a lot of places, met a lot of people." Walter nodded, a strange gleam in his eyes. "I bet you have. Ever had any strange encounters?" Jake chuckled, though he felt a slight unease. "A few, mostly just folks who like to talk a little too much. Had a guy once who wouldn't stop quoting Bible verses at me, but nothing too crazy." Walter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know, Jake, there's a lot of weird things out there on the open road, things that can change a person, make them different." Jake shifted in his seat, feeling the air grow thick with tension. "What do you mean?" Walter's smile faded. "Ever hear about the Wendigo?" Jake shook his head. "No. What's that?" "It's an old legend," Walter said, his voice lowering. "A creature that was once human but turned into a monster because of its insatiable hunger. It roams the land, always starving, always hunting." Jake forced a laugh. "Sounds like something out of a horror movie." Walter turned to him, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Oh, it's real. I saw one once, a long time ago. Changed my life." Jake's skin prickled. He glanced out the window, the cornfields passing by in a blur. "You sure it wasn't just a trick of the light or something?" Walter shook his head. "No, it was real. And once you see something like that, you can't go back to the way things were. You start to see the darkness in everything, in everyone." The car seemed to grow colder, the shadows inside lengthening. Jake felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. "You mind if we roll down a window or something? It's getting kind of stuffy in here." Walter's eyes never left the road. "Sure thing, Jake." Jake reached for the window crank, but as he did, he noticed something odd. The dashboard was covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by fingernails. He glanced at Walter, who was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. "What's with the scratches?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Walter smiled again, that same unsettling smile. "Oh, those. Just a reminder of what's out there. Sometimes people don't believe until they see for themselves." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean?" Walter's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I've picked up a lot of hitchhikers over the years, Jake. Seen a lot of things. Some people, they don't make it." A chill ran down Jake's spine. "What are you talking about?" Walter's eyes met his, and for a moment Jake saw something dark and hungry lurking in their depths. "Sometimes you have to feed the darkness. Keep it at bay." Jake's mind raced. He glanced at the door handle, wondering if he could jump out, but the car was going too fast. "Look, I think I've had enough. You can let me out here." Walter shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Jake. Not yet." Jake's pulse quickened. He glanced at the scratches on the dashboard, his mind flashing to the stories he had heard over the years, stories of people who vanished without a trace, last seen hitchhiking on lonely roads. Desperation surged through him. He lunged for the door handle, but Walter was faster. He grabbed Jake's arm, his grip like iron. "You're not going anywhere, Jake." Jake struggled, but Walter's strength was inhuman. He felt a cold, clammy hand close around his throat and panic set in. "Please," he gasped, "let me go." Walter's face twisted into a grotesque mask of fury. "You don't understand, do you? You're part of the bargain. You have to feed the darkness, or it will consume us all." Jake's vision blurred as the air was cut off from his lungs. He kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was Walter's face, eyes glowing with an unnatural light, a look of ravenous hunger etched into his features. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the cornfield. Walter dragged Jake's limp body from the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. Satisfied that they were alone, he began to dig. As he buried Jake's body, he whispered a prayer to the darkness, a plea for mercy. He knew it was only a matter of time before the hunger returned, before he would be forced to feed it again. When the deed was done, he climbed back into the car, his hands trembling. He started the engine and drove off into the night, leaving the road and the cornfields behind. In the silence of the car, he whispered to himself, a mantra to keep the fear at bay. Feed the darkness and it won't consume you. Feed the darkness and it won't consume you. But deep down he knew that it was only a matter of time. The darkness was always hungry, always waiting, and one day it would come for him too.